Samuel Lancaster Jr., the only son of one of America's wealthiest businessmen, had always been known for his love of the high life. He had grown up in the glittering heart of New York City, surrounded by luxury, power, and privilege. His father, Samuel Lancaster Sr., had built an empire from the ground up, amassing billions through investments and real estate ventures. But young Samuel, or Sammy, as his friends called him, had never known hardship. His life was a series of high-stakes parties, exclusive clubs, and trips to exotic locations. The world, as far as he was concerned, was his playground. But when Sammy made headlines for losing $3 million in a single night at a high-end Las Vegas casino, Samuel Sr. finally hit his limit. He'd overlooked his son's reckless spending before, but this time, the sheer scale of Sammy's losses and the public embarrassment it caused was more than he could tolerate. He decided that it was time to teach his son a lesson, one that would force him to grow up and understand responsibility. After a long, tense meeting, Samuel Sr. informed his son of his decision. Sammy, expecting a lecture or maybe even a slap on the wrist, was stunned when his father laid out his punishment. "I've arranged for you to marry Lydia Carlson," Samuel Sr. said, his tone icy and unyielding. "Marry?" Sammy choked, his face paling. "Dad, you can't be serious." "Oh, I'm very serious," his father replied, his gaze steely. "Lydia is the daughter of a cattle farmer in Little Creek, a small village in the Midwest. They're good, honest people. Maybe being around them will remind you of what it means to work hard and appreciate what you have." Sammy couldn't believe it. The idea of living on a cattle farm, married to a woman he'd never even met, seemed impossible. But as much as he protested, his father wouldn't budge. The wedding was arranged quickly, and before Sammy knew it, he found himself in the small, rural town of Little Creek, staring down the aisle at Lydia Carlson. Lydia was a far cry from the glamorous women Sammy was used to dating. She was quiet, reserved, and had the look of someone who had spent most of her life working in the open fields, her skin tanned and her hands calloused. She wasn't unattractive, but she was different, grounded in a way Sammy couldn't understand. The ceremony was simple, a far cry from the lavish events Sammy usually attended. Afterward, Lydia took him to the small, modest farmhouse that would now be his home. Sammy was horrified by the simplicity of his new life, the lack of luxury, the early mornings spent helping with farm chores. He struggled, resented it, and clashed with Lydia, who found his arrogance and entitlement unbearable. But over the next few weeks, something began to change. Forced to confront the reality of a simpler life, Sammy started to adapt, learning how to work with his hands, how to care for the animals, and how to live without the constant distractions he'd grown used to. Lydia, though wary of his initial attitude, softened as she saw him make genuine efforts to adjust. They began to find common ground, talking late into the evening about their vastly different lives, sharing stories and dreams. By the time 3 months had passed, Sammy felt like a different person. The shallow, reckless part of him was fading, replaced by a new sense of purpose and gratitude. He found himself looking forward to the quiet mornings on the farm, the satisfaction of a day's hard work, and even the quiet companionship he'd found with Lydia. Then, one day, Samuel Sr. decided to visit his son, curious to see if the punishment he'd imposed had made any difference. He expected to find Sammy miserable and desperate to leave, but what he saw stunned him as Samuel Sr. stepped out of his luxury car onto the dusty gravel road leading up to the farmhouse. He looked around, his eyes narrowing. This was the kind of place he'd never expected his son to end up. The air was thick with the scent of earth and livestock, far from the sterile, perfumed world of high-rise offices and private jets he was accustomed to. The farmhouse itself was modest, even quaint, with its white clapboard walls and a large, wraparound porch where Lydia's father sat on a rocking chair, nodding politely in greeting. Samuel Sr. barely acknowledged him as he scanned the property, searching for his son. To his surprise, he found Sammy by the barn, working alongside Lydia, both of them busy mucking out stalls. Samuel Sr. paused, almost disbelieving. He'd expected Sammy to look bedraggled, miserable, and resentful. But instead, his son looked content. There was a ruggedness about him that hadn't been there before, a quiet confidence that had replaced the swagger. His clothes were dusty and worn, his hands were calloused, and his face bore the healthy tan of someone who had spent his days outdoors. But there was an ease to his expression, a groundedness that was startling. "Dad," Sammy called, straightening up and wiping his brow as he noticed his father. "Wasn't expecting you so soon." He walked over, a slight smile on his face, with Lydia close behind him. She gave Samuel Sr. a polite nod but didn't offer her hand. Her face was calm, steady, and filled with the kind of self-assurance that made Samuel Sr. uneasy. She wasn't intimidated by him or the wealth he represented. If anything, she looked at him with mild curiosity, as if he were the one who didn't belong. Samuel Sr. took in his son's appearance, unable to hide his shock. "Well," he said stiffly, "I thought I'd come see how you were holding up. Looks like you've adapted." Sammy shrugged, a lightness in his expression. "Guess I have. It was tough at first, but I'm getting the hang of it." He glanced at Lydia, who was standing beside him, her expression softening slightly as she looked at him. "This life, it's different from what I'm used to, but it feels real. There's something honest about it." Samuel Sr. raised an eyebrow, feeling both bewildered and slightly defensive. "So what? You're happy here? You think you'll spend the rest of your life mucking stalls and tending cattle?" Sammy looked at him, his gaze steady. "I don't know about the rest of my life," he admitted, "but I do know that being here has changed me. I've learned things I never would have understood back in the city. Hard work, patience, learning to be okay with silence and simplicity. Lydia and her family, they work hard every day, and they're grateful for what they have. It's not about the money here, Dad. It's about something else." Samuel Sr. felt a pang of guilt and confusion, a mix of emotions he wasn't accustomed to. He had spent his entire life chasing success, building wealth, and accumulating power, all with the hope of giving his son a life free of struggle. But now, standing on this humble farm, he was beginning to realize that maybe he'd missed something important along the way. He cleared his throat, looking away as he composed himself. "So, is this what you want?" he asked quietly, his voice softer than before. "Is this life? This marriage? Are you happy?" Sammy glanced at Lydia, who gave him a small, encouraging smile. He took her hand, an act that surprised his father. "Yeah," he said, his voice firm. "I think I am." They stood there in silence for a moment, the weight of the revelation settling over them all. Samuel Sr. could see that his son had found something here that he hadn't been able to give him, something that no amount of money could buy. Eventually, Sammy broke the silence. "I'm not saying I won't come back to the city or that I'll never work with you again, but for now I need this. I need to understand what life is really about, and being here with Lydia has shown me that." Samuel Sr. nodded slowly, feeling a strange mixture of pride and sorrow. "I never thought I'd say this, but maybe this was the best thing that could have happened to you." He paused, glancing at Lydia with a newfound respect. "And maybe it's what I needed to see, too." He extended his hand to Lydia, who shook it, her grip firm and confident. "Thank you," he said quietly. "Thank you for taking care of him, and for helping him become someone I'm proud of." Lydia smiled, nodding respectfully. "He's worked hard to get here. I didn't do this alone." As Samuel Sr. left the farm, he felt as if he were seeing his son for the first time. He had come to teach Sammy a lesson, but in the end, it was he who had been taught. After Samuel Sr. left the farm, life continued quietly, with Sammy and Lydia settling into a comfortable routine. Over the next few weeks, Sammy found himself increasingly at home in the rural lifestyle. He rose with the dawn, worked side by side with Lydia and her family, and learned the intricate workings of the farm, from the best times to feed the cattle to the methods of repairing fences and managing the land. The hard work brought him a sense of fulfillment he'd never felt in his previous life. Lydia's father, a rugged man named Hank Carlson, had initially been skeptical of Sammy. He had heard about the wealthy city boy and had no illusions about what such people were usually like. Spoiled, arrogant, and dismissive of the simple ways of life. But, to Hank's surprise, Sammy began to earn his respect. Sammy showed a genuine willingness to learn, admitting what he didn't know, and humbling himself before the demands of farm life. Hank saw his daughter's quiet influence on Sammy and, in time, came to accept that perhaps this marriage was not just a punishment, but an unexpected blessing. As Sammy's skills improved, he and Lydia grew closer. At first, their relationship had been strained, a marriage born of convenience and necessity rather than love. But now, as they shared the daily hardships and small victories of farm life, they found a true partnership blossoming. Their conversations became deeper, moving from the trivialities of farm tasks to their dreams, fears, and memories. Lydia, who had once viewed Sammy as nothing more than an entitled city boy, saw a new side of him, a man who had learned humility and resilience. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sun set over the fields, Sammy turned to Lydia, his face earnest. "I know we didn't choose this marriage," he said softly, "but I want you to know that I'm grateful. You've shown me a world I never understood, and I've grown in ways I never thought possible." Lydia looked at him, her eyes warm. "It's mutual, Sammy. I'll admit, I wasn't thrilled at first either," she said with a small smile. "But you've shown me that people can change. You're not the man I first met." They shared a quiet moment, a bond unspoken yet understood. Their lives had merged in ways neither of them could have anticipated, and in that shared understanding, they found the beginnings of something deeper. One day, a letter arrived from Samuel Sr. It was brief but respectful, acknowledging the growth he'd seen in his son and expressing a tentative hope for reconciliation. Though he had once been determined to keep Sammy grounded on the farm indefinitely, Samuel Sr. had come to see the value in the life his son had built with Lydia. He now respected the simplicity and hard work of farm life, understanding that Sammy's newfound sense of purpose was something he could never have instilled through wealth or status alone. In the letter, Samuel Sr. proposed a new arrangement. He offered Sammy the opportunity to return to the family business, but only if he wanted to. If Sammy chose to remain on the farm, Samuel Sr. promised to respect his choice and support him in any way he could. As Sammy read the letter, he felt a rush of emotions: relief, gratitude, and a bittersweet realization that he had indeed changed. He no longer felt the same longing for his old life, the glittering parties and easy comforts. This farm, this quiet life with Lydia, had given him something far more valuable. Later that evening, Sammy shared the letter with Lydia. She listened carefully, nodding as he read his father's words. When he was done, she looked at him thoughtfully. "Do you want to go back?" she asked, her tone gentle but direct. Sammy took a deep breath, looking out over the fields, the familiar scent of earth and cattle grounding him in the present. "I don't think so," he said slowly. "I mean, maybe one day I'd like to visit, but I don't want to leave here. This life, it's become part of me. And you're part of me now, too." Lydia's eyes softened, a hint of relief flickering across her face. She reached for his hand, their fingers entwining naturally. "I'd like that," she whispered, her voice filled with a quiet joy. In the months that followed, Sammy and Lydia continued to build a life together, blending the practicalities of farm work with the deepening connection between them. They decided to expand the farm, adding new livestock and experimenting with sustainable farming techniques. Sammy used some of his trust fund carefully and sparingly to make improvements that would benefit the entire operation. Lydia's father, initially wary of Sammy's ideas, saw the positive changes and gave his blessing to their plans. News of Sammy's transformation began to spread throughout the community. People who had once looked at him with suspicion now respected him as a genuine member of their town, someone who had earned his place through hard work and integrity. Sammy became involved in the community, attending town meetings and volunteering for local events. The townspeople, many of whom had seen him as a spoiled outsider, began to appreciate his humility and the way he had embraced their way of life. One evening, as Sammy and Lydia stood on the edge of their property, watching the sun dip below the horizon, Sammy felt a profound sense of peace. His journey, once filled with uncertainty and resentment, had led him to a life of purpose, connection, and love. He knew now that this life, simple, honest, and deeply fulfilling, was what he had been searching for all along. As the seasons changed, so did Sammy and Lydia's bond. They worked side by side through scorching summer days and chilly autumn mornings, learning to rely on each other in ways that went beyond the tasks of the farm. Their partnership grew into something steady and unbreakable, built on shared work, mutual respect, and the unspoken understanding that they had both changed in ways neither had anticipated. By the time winter set in, they had completed several improvements to the farm. Sammy had invested in upgraded irrigation for the crops, new equipment, and fencing repairs that had been long overdue. Lydia's father, Hank, had quietly observed these changes, taking note of Sammy's transformation from a spoiled rich kid to a man who had not only accepted farm life but had come to love it. One frosty morning, while Sammy was working in the barn, Hank approached him, leaning against the stall with a thoughtful look on his face. He cleared his throat, and Sammy looked up, wiping his hands on a rag. "You know, I didn't think much of you at first," Hank said, his voice rough but sincere. "Didn't think you'd last more than a week here. Figured you'd be gone by the time the first sunrise hit. But I'll admit, I was wrong about you." Sammy's brow furrowed in surprise. Praise from Hank was rare, and he'd spent months working hard in the hopes of earning it. Hank continued, his gaze steady. "You're a good man, Sammy. You've done more for this farm in these few months than I've managed in years. And you've treated my daughter with respect. I may not have asked for this marriage, but I'm glad you're here." The words, so simple and direct, touched Sammy deeply. He nodded, the weight of Hank's acceptance settling over him. "Thank you, Hank. That means more than you know," he said quietly. As the winter months rolled on, Sammy and Lydia continued their work, facing each new challenge with determination and a growing sense of unity. They learned to anticipate each other's thoughts, working together with a kind of seamless rhythm that came only from spending every day together. Lydia, once skeptical of the marriage and reluctant to let herself hope for anything more, found herself feeling something she hadn't expected: happiness. Meanwhile, back in the city, Samuel Sr. had been following his son's progress through updates from local contacts in Little Creek. The news of his son's transformation filled him with a strange mix of pride and regret. He knew that Sammy had become the man he'd always hoped he would be, but it saddened him to realize that he'd never been able to teach his son those lessons himself. One evening, Samuel Sr. received a call from Sammy. It was rare for them to speak now, and he immediately picked up, a hint of warmth in his tone. "Dad," Sammy began, his voice steady, "I just wanted to thank you for everything, for pushing me to do this even if I didn't understand it at the time. Being here has changed my life." Samuel Sr. paused, feeling a surge of emotions he hadn't anticipated. "I'm glad to hear that, son. I can see that you've become someone to be proud of." They spoke briefly, with Samuel Sr. expressing his admiration for Sammy's growth and Sammy assuring his father that he planned to continue making a life on the farm. There was a new openness between them, an unspoken understanding that despite their differences, they were finally at peace. Spring arrived, bringing new life to the farm and fresh opportunities. Sammy and Lydia decided to host a community gathering, inviting friends, neighbors, and family to celebrate the improvements they had made and the bonds they had formed. They decorated the barn with string lights, set up tables with food prepared by Lydia and her mother, and created a space where people could gather, laugh, and share stories. As the sun set and the festivities began, Sammy and Lydia stood together, watching the people who had become their friends and family. For the first time, Sammy felt a profound sense of belonging. He realized that he was no longer just a visitor or an outsider. He was part of this community. Samuel Sr. arrived later that evening, greeted warmly by Hank and the other townsfolk. He mingled with the guests, listening to their stories and learning about the impact his son had made. Watching Sammy laugh and talk with the townspeople, Samuel Sr. felt a deep sense of pride. This wasn't the son who had once gambled away millions in a single night, This was a man who had built a life of meaning, who had earned the respect and love of those around him. As the night wore on, Lydia took Sammy's hand, pulling him aside for a quiet moment away from the crowd. She looked at him, her eyes filled with a warmth that took him by surprise. "Sammy," she began, her voice soft. "When we first got married, I never thought we'd end up here. I didn't think I'd ever find someone I could truly be with, but you've proven me wrong in every way." He squeezed her hand, feeling the weight of her words. "I feel the same way, Lydia. You've shown me a life I didn't even know I wanted. You've made me a better person." They shared a quiet, heartfelt moment, the celebration continuing around them. Sammy knew, as he looked into her eyes, that his life had changed in ways he couldn't have imagined. He had found purpose, love, and a sense of self that he had never known before. As they returned to the festivities, Sammy caught his father's eye. Samuel Sr. gave him a nod of approval, his expression one of quiet pride and acceptance. Sammy nodded back, acknowledging the journey they had both undertaken, a journey that had brought them closer and helped them find the people they were meant to become. As the spring gathering at the farm continued, Sammy felt a warmth and fulfillment that he had never experienced in his former life. The small celebration held under the lights in the barn was a far cry from the exclusive parties and galas he'd once attended, but there was a beauty in its simplicity, a realness that made it feel infinitely more meaningful. Throughout the evening, Sammy watched as people from the community laughed, shared stories, and enjoyed the food Lydia had prepared with her family. Children played in the open fields, couples danced to the old country tunes playing from a speaker, and elders gathered in clusters, reminiscing about days gone by. Everyone here belonged, and Sammy was beginning to see that he did too. As the night drew on, he and Lydia found themselves seated with Hank and Samuel Sr., the two men who had shaped his life in such different ways. It was the first time they'd all sat together, and Sammy could feel the weight of the moment. Hank, who had once been suspicious of Sammy's presence, now treated him like a son, sharing bits of wisdom he'd learned from years of hard work on the land. And Samuel Sr., the man who had always seemed larger than life, now looked at his son with something like awe, realizing that Sammy had found strength and purpose that even he couldn't have predicted. The conversation between the four of them was light, filled with laughter and stories. Hank told Samuel Sr. about Sammy's early days on the farm, sharing the funny moments when Sammy had struggled to adapt to farm life. "You should have seen him, Samuel," Hank chuckled. "He was like a fish out of water, barely knew how to handle a shovel. But I'll tell you this, he never gave up." Samuel Sr. laughed, shaking his head. "That's my boy," he said with a glint of pride. "Stubborn as they come. I suppose he gets that from me." Lydia smiled, her hand resting on Sammy's. "He's done more than adapt. He's become part of this place, part of the family." As the conversation continued, Sammy felt a swell of gratitude. He realized how lucky he was to have two fathers, one who had given him every opportunity and another who had shown him the value of hard work and humility. And, of course, Lydia, who had stood beside him through every struggle, her steady presence grounding him in a way he hadn't known he needed. Eventually, the gathering wound down, with neighbors and friends bidding their goodbyes, thanking Lydia and Sammy for the beautiful evening. The once lively barn grew quiet, the lanterns casting a warm glow over the hay bales and the lingering smell of food and laughter still hanging in the air. As they began to clean up, Sammy caught sight of his father standing alone outside, looking up at the stars. Sammy walked over, feeling the need to share one last moment with him. Samuel Sr. turned to him, his face softened by a rare vulnerability. "You know, Sammy," he began quietly, "when I sent you here, I thought I was teaching you a lesson. I thought I knew what was best for you. But I see now that I didn't understand you as well as I thought." Sammy nodded, his voice low. "I know, Dad. And honestly, I didn't understand myself either." He looked out at the fields, the place that had become his sanctuary. "But I found something here. I found a life I didn't know I wanted. And I'm grateful you pushed me to see that." Samuel Sr. placed a hand on his son's shoulder, his expression filled with pride. You've become the man I always hoped you would be. And it wasn't my wealth or influence that got you here. It was you. The choices you made, the work you put in. I'm proud of you, son." They stood together in silence, the connection between them deeper than any words could express. They had both changed, both grown, and both understood now that the journey they had taken was as much about finding themselves as it was about finding each other. As Samuel Sr. left that night, Sammy felt a sense of closure, a peace he hadn't realized he was searching for. He turned back to the farmhouse, where Lydia was waiting for him, her face glowing with warmth. She reached for his hand, and together, they walked back inside, ready to face whatever the future held. The farm had become more than just a place for Sammy. It was now his home, a life filled with purpose, love, and belonging. And as he settled into the quiet rhythm of life in Little Creek, he knew that he had finally found the life he was meant to live, surrounded by people who valued him for who he truly was. In the days that followed the spring gathering, Sammy found himself reflecting deeply on everything he had experienced. Each sunrise over the fields, each shared meal with Lydia and her family, each moment spent in the quiet simplicity of Little Creek had woven a new layer into the person he'd become. He was no longer the restless, reckless man he had once been. He was someone who understood the beauty of patience, the value of humility, and the strength found in hard work. As the weeks turned into months, Sammy and Lydia continued to pour their energy into the farm, expanding it and introducing new methods of sustainable farming that Sammy had researched. They built a new barn, added more livestock, and even began selling produce and dairy products to local markets, helping the farm to thrive. Their partnership became a perfect balance of vision and diligence, a dynamic built on mutual respect and a love that had blossomed naturally over time. Lydia's father, Hank, was deeply proud of what they had built together. Watching his daughter and Sammy work side by side, he felt a sense of satisfaction he hadn't known before. Sammy had proven himself to be the son he'd never had, and though he rarely expressed it in words, Hank made sure Sammy knew that he had his respect and admiration. News of Sammy's success on the farm eventually spread back to the city. People who had once mocked him for his failures at the casino were now hearing a different story. A story of transformation, humility, and resilience. Even his old friends were surprised to hear of the life he had chosen, some of them reaching out to express their admiration for his newfound purpose. Sammy felt no bitterness toward them. He simply hoped they, too, would find something meaningful in their own lives. One morning, Sammy received an unexpected invitation. The local high school had invited him to speak at their graduation ceremony, asking him to share his story with the students who were about to embark on their own journeys. At first, he hesitated, unsure if his life held any real lessons for them. But Lydia encouraged him, reminding him of how far he'd come and how his story might inspire others to see beyond appearances, to find value in hard work and character. Standing on the stage that day, facing a crowd of bright-eyed students and proud families, Sammy felt a surge of nervousness. But as he began to speak, he realized how naturally the words came, as if they'd been waiting for this moment. "I used to think success was about money, status, and what other people thought of me," he began. "I thought that the more I had, the happier I'd be. But I was wrong. True success isn't about what you own. It's about what you give back and the person you become." He spoke about the lessons he'd learned on the farm, the value of honesty, and the importance of living with integrity. He shared how Lydia and her family had taught him that fulfillment wasn't found in luxury, but in purpose and connection. "Find what makes you feel alive," he told them. "And don't be afraid to work hard for it, even if it's different from what others expect. Be true to yourself, and remember that the journey isn't always easy, but it's worth it." The speech was met with warm applause, and afterward, several students and parents approached him, thanking him for his words. They had seen something in his story that resonated, something that gave them hope for their own lives. Sammy felt a quiet pride, knowing that he had made a difference, however small, in the lives of others. As he drove back to the farm that evening, Sammy reflected on the unexpected path his life had taken. He had started out lost and directionless, a man who didn't know his own worth. But now, he was someone who had found not only love and purpose but a sense of self that he had never known before. That night, as he sat with Lydia on the porch, watching the stars twinkle above them, he felt a sense of contentment that ran deeper than any fleeting thrill he had once chased. He knew that he had found his place in the world, a life built on values that mattered, surrounded by people who truly understood him. With Lydia by his side and a future that stretched out before him, Sammy felt ready for whatever came next. He had learned that life wasn't about the destination, but the journey, the choices made, the lessons learned, and the love shared along the way. And as he looked out over the fields that had become his home, he knew that he was exactly where he was meant to be. In the quiet of that evening, as Sammy and Lydia sat on the porch, the farm stretched peacefully around them, the fields bathed in the silver light of the moon. Sammy took Lydia's hand, a sense of completeness settling over him. They had come so far together, from strangers bound by an unexpected circumstance to true partners and friends. Their journey had been filled with challenges, but each one had brought them closer, forging a bond that now felt unbreakable. Lydia looked at him, her eyes soft. "Did you ever think," she murmured, "that you'd find yourself here, in a place like this, with a life like this?" Sammy smiled, shaking his head. "No," he admitted, "but I'm grateful. For all of it. For you. I wouldn't trade this life for anything." As they sat in comfortable silence, the faint sound of cattle lowing in the distance and the rustling of the wind through the fields, Sammy felt a deep peace wash over him. This farm, these moments, the life he had built with Lydia, these were the things that truly mattered. He had learned that wealth and status were fleeting, but a life built on love, respect, and purpose was lasting. Not long after, Sammy's father, Samuel Sr., paid a final visit to the farm, bringing with him a mix of pride and humility. He'd come to see his son's life for what it truly was, to witness firsthand the man Sammy had become. As they walked the property together, Samuel Sr. shared how he'd come to realize that he'd gained something precious too. A son he respected, a man who had earned his place in the world not through money, but through hard work and integrity. When they returned to the porch, Samuel Sr. took Sammy's hand in a rare, heartfelt moment. "You've made me proud, son," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You've built a life here, one that's worth more than anything I could have given you." The words hung in the air, a bond forged between father and son that had grown stronger through this journey of self-discovery. Sammy nodded, knowing that he had not only earned his father's pride, but he had also found pride in himself. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting a warm glow over the land, Sammy, Lydia, and Samuel Sr. sat together, quietly watching the last rays of light fade away. It was a simple, beautiful moment, a testament to the journey they had all taken. In that final, golden hour, Sammy knew that his life had come full circle. He had found everything he'd been searching for: love, purpose, and peace. And as the stars began to appear, he knew that whatever the future held, he was exactly where he was meant to be. With Lydia's hand in his and his father's approval resting in his heart, Sammy was ready for the life that lay before him. A life built on the foundation of everything he had learned, everything he had become.